Have you ever felt like you were living life on a delay? While everyone around you seemed to figure things out in their 20s, the career momentum, the relationship milestones, the easy confidence, you were, what? Struggling, confused, watching from the outside with a sensation in your chest like standing behind glass. You see them at 25, promoted, engaged, posting photos from apartments they own. They speak the language of success fluently. They navigate social hierarchies without visible effort. They know what they want and move toward it in straight lines. And then there's you at 25, underemployed or chronically between jobs, relationships that never quite cohere, living situations that feel temporary even when they're not. You don't speak that language. The hierarchies feel like theater. What you want keeps shifting because you're tracking something beneath the surface that no one else seems to notice. The question arrives with physical weight. What's wrong with me? Here's what you're not being told. This isn't universal 20s confusion. This affects specific personality types with measurable precision. If you're an INFJ, you represent approximately 1.5% of the population, one person in every 70. If you're an INTJ, roughly 2%, 1 in 50. These percentages aren't identity badges, they're statistical markers of cognitive architecture. You process reality through what Jung called introverted intuition, a function he described as the strangest of all to outside observers. While the majority processes through concrete sensory data, you synthesize through symbols, patterns, unconscious connections that produce insights you can't always explain. This isn't preference. This is structure. The world is built by and for the 73% who are sensors. Educational systems reward immediate application, measurable outputs, concrete learning, your whole brain pattern recognition, what neuroscientist Dario Nardi describes as Zen-like synchronization across all neocortex regions, gets systematically devalued. You were told throughout development that you think too much, read too much, care about the world too much. But here's the paradox that changes everything. These same individuals who flounder through their 20s often flourish dramatically after 35. Not despite their early difficulty, because of it. The ones who couldn't play the games, couldn't build the conventional persona, couldn't merge with collective norms. They're the ones who, at 40, 45, 50, demonstrate depth that conventional success cannot match. Carl Jung discovered a developmental process he called individuation, the journey from ego-driven achievement towards psychological wholeness. For most people, this journey begins at midlife. For rare types like you, it begins prematurely. You're not behind. You're following a different developmental curriculum entirely. This video reveals 3 things: the hidden psychological architecture causing your early struggle, why that struggle becomes your eventual advantage, and what integration actually looks like when it arrives. If you've spent years feeling like you're living on the wrong timeline, you're about to understand why your delay might be the most precise thing about you. To understand why rare minds follow a different path, we need Jung's map of psychological development, and where most people's map fails to account for you. Jung called his central discovery individuation, but this isn't what you think it means. Not self-improvement, not becoming a better version of yourself. Self-realization, capital S, the gradual incarnation of potentials you carried from birth, unfolding across an entire lifetime according to an internal timeline that rarely matches external expectations. Jung used the metaphor of the acorn. An oak tree doesn't become an oak, it already is one encoded in seed form. Development means allowing what's already present to actualize. But actualization follows soul time, not social time. And for most people, that timeline breaks cleanly into two distinct phases. The first half of life, birth to roughly 35, dedicates itself to ego building. You develop your social mask, what Jung called the persona. You learn to compete, you achieve, you adapt to society's reward structures, you climb hierarchies, you prove yourself valuable according to collective standards. This is the phase of external construction: career, relationship, status, material security. The second half of life shifts towards something fundamentally different: integration. You confront what you've been avoiding, your shadow, the repressed material living outside conscious awareness. You begin dialoguing with the unconscious rather than defending against it. The goal stops being achievement and becomes wholeness. Jung called this the movement from ego-directed life to self-directed life. For the majority, this timeline works. Build your persona in your 20s and 30s. Face your shadow in your 40s and 50s. Integrate toward wholeness in your 60s and beyond. But you're not the majority. Your cognitive architecture, dominant introverted intuition, processes reality through unconscious synthesis, symbolic pattern recognition, future-oriented abstraction. Jung observed these types firsthand and wrote that they appear to others as spectral Cassandras dreaded for their tactlessness, eternally misunderstood. Not because they're socially incompetent by choice, but because their natural mode of consciousness operates orthogonally to collective norms. When everyone around you is building persona, you're already questioning the masks. When they're climbing hierarchies, you're tracking patterns beneath the structure. When they're adapting to reward systems, you're feeling the wrongness of adapting to something that contradicts your inner blueprint. This isn't rebellion. This is your psyche refusing to follow a developmental map that wasn't drawn for your cognitive structure. Jung himself noted that individuation requires divesting the self of the false wrappings of the persona. But what happens when you never fully wrapped yourself in the first place? What happens when your psyche rejects the conventional timeline and forces you into premature engagement with material that's supposed to wait until midlife? You experience early struggle, profound isolation, the sensation of living in the wrong decade of your own life. But you're not broken. You're following a different curriculum, and that curriculum demands something from you earlier than it demands from others, something that will eventually become your deepest advantage. To understand why this alternative curriculum creates such early difficulty, we need to examine the specific cognitive architecture that makes adaptation nearly impossible, and why that impossibility is structural, not personal. Your struggle isn't psychological weakness, it's architectural specificity. Both INFJ and INTJ types share the same cognitive structure at the foundation: dominant introverted intuition with inferior extroverted sensing. This isn't personality preference. This is how your brain prioritizes information processing, and it creates predictable consequences in physical reality. Dominant Ni operates as your primary lens. You synthesize information through pattern recognition that happens beneath conscious awareness, producing insights that feel like they emerge fully formed. You track trajectories, implications, future possibilities. You see the shape of things before they materialize, but your inferior function, extroverted sensing, remains underdeveloped throughout your entire first half of life. C governs immediate sensory engagement, physical coordination, present moment awareness, environmental attunement, practical execution. In daily life, this manifests with surgical precision. You walk into a room and fluorescent lights feel like an assault. Background noise that others filter unconsciously overwhelms your nervous system. You knock over the water glass reaching for your phone. You show up to the meeting on the wrong day because you were tracking the pattern of what the meeting meant rather than the concrete detail of when it occurred. You feel, as one INFJ described it, like you're free falling ahead of the present moment. your consciousness tilted perpetually toward what's coming, which means you chronically miss what's here. Your body feels like equipment you're operating remotely rather than inhabiting directly. The developmental timeline for cognitive functions follows a predictable sequence. Dominant Ni crystallizes between ages 6 and 12, early mastery of your primary mode. Your auxiliary function develops through adolescence. Extroverted feeling for INFJs, extroverted thinking for INTJs. These give you some capacity for external engagement. Your tertiary function begins integrating in your 30s and 40s. But your inferior SE? That doesn't reach functional integration until midlife and beyond. This means you spend your first 4 decades with underdeveloped practical capacities, precisely the capacities that educational systems, workplace cultures, and social hierarchies reward most heavily. Now layer in the persona problem. The persona functions as your bridge to collective reality, the social mask you construct by learning which traits earn reward, which earn punishment, what image allows you to belong. Normal development involves building this mask consciously and strategically throughout your 20s, its protective infrastructure. But rare types fail to build conventional persona, not from rebellion, from constitutional inability. Your Ni dominance creates what personality researcher Lenore Thompson observed as inherent feelings of alienation and an ironic sense of humor that protects from self-revelation. You develop as what people call an old soul, the child counseling adults, the adolescent finding peer concerns trivial, the young person who can't participate in games that feel like theater. You watch others construct their masks with apparent ease. You cannot. The mask feels like suffocation. Inauthenticity registers in your body as physical wrongness. So you withdraw or you present without persona, raw and unprotected, and both options create immediate social consequences. Without developed persona, you lack the container that would normally hold unconscious material at bay. Your boundaries between conscious and unconscious remain more permeable than they should be at your developmental stage. You feel too much, see too much, carry too much, and you're doing all of this in a world built by and for the 73% who are sensors. Educational systems reward concrete learning, immediate application, measurable outputs. Your whole brain pattern synthesis gets systematically devalued. You were told throughout childhood, you think too much, you read too much, you care about the world too much, you worry about things that don't matter, but they do matter. You're tracking real patterns, you're seeing actual trajectories, you're processing information that censor-majority culture dismisses as irrelevant until the future you predicted arrives. And by then, everyone's moved on to dismissing your next prediction. This is not personal failure. This is the daily experience of operating cognitive architecture that society cannot accommodate, lacking the protective infrastructure that would make the operation sustainable during precisely the decades when adaptation determines social survival. Your early struggle is structural, which means your later advantage will be too. But cognitive architecture and persona failure explain only half the picture. The real reason rare types struggle early involves something that arrives before you're developmentally ready. Something Jung spent 7 years of his own life confronting. The shadow is not what you think it is, not evil, not your dark side. Jung defined it precisely. Everything within you that lives outside conscious awareness. All psychic contents the ego has ignored, denied, or cut off from recognition. He called it the thing a person has no wish to be. But here's what changes everything. Shadow contains not just rejected darkness, but repressed light. Your creativity that felt too vulnerable to express. Your sensitivity that got punished early. Your capability that threatened others. All of it lives in shadow until you're ready to reclaim it. For most people, shadow confrontation arrives at midlife. 40s, 50s, the conventional timeline when the persona you've built begins cracking, and material you've spent decades avoiding demands recognition. This is the expected sequence. Build your mask in your 20s, achieve through your 30s, confront what you've been hiding in your 40s. You encounter your shadow in adolescence. Sometimes childhood, not because you chose premature depth work, because your cognitive architecture makes it structurally inevitable. Three dynamics converge. First, your incomplete persona development leaves the boundary between conscious and unconscious more permeable than it should be. Without adequate protective infrastructure, unconscious material seeps through constantly. You feel emotions with intensity that others don't seem to experience. You see dynamics in your family that everyone else denies. You carry awareness or you have no framework for processing. Second, your resistance to collective norms means you cannot rely on conventional structures to contain unconscious material. Most people distribute their psychological burden through participation in collective systems, career hierarchies, social rituals, shared beliefs. These structures hold shadow at bay through externalization, but you cannot merge with those systems. Your psyche refuses, which means you carry the burden individually without collective support. Third, your outsider status often results in family scapegoating. Every family system generates shadow, traits and feelings the collective denies. Someone must carry that disowned material, the sensitive child, the one who sees too much, the one who doesn't fit the family narrative. You become the designated carrier of what everyone else refuses to acknowledge. This creates forced engagement with shadow content before adequate ego strength develops to hold it. The typical shadow integration sequence involves 4 stages. First, persona breakdown, the mask you've built stops functioning. Second, emergence of repressed material, rage, grief, shame, disowned capabilities surface without warning. Third, the confrontation Jung called nigredo, the blackening, a period of psychological darkness where everything you thought you knew about yourself dissolves. Fourth, integration, reclaiming and incorporating the shadow material into conscious personality. Jung himself experienced this sequence between 1913 and 1919, roughly 7 years of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He was in his late 30s, professionally established, with enough ego strength to survive the dissolution. You experience this in your teens or 20s, while your peers are smoothly navigating social hierarchies, building personas, achieving conventional milestones. You're psychologically fragmenting. The ground beneath your identity keeps cracking open. You cannot maintain stability because unconscious material keeps flooding through. The physical sensation, drowning in feelings that aren't all yours, seeing patterns you have no one to verify, carrying weight you cannot name. But here's the reframe that matters. This early confrontation, as brutal as it is, creates an advantage that delayed confrontation cannot match. Shadow integration becomes survival necessity rather than optional midlife project. You cannot postpone the work because the work is happening to you whether you're ready or not. And those forced into premature integration often achieve deeper, eventual wholeness because they develop the capacity young, when the psyche is still flexible, and because they had no choice but to learn the skills that others can avoid until crisis forces them. Your early shadow work isn't developmental failure. It's accelerated curriculum. You're being initiated into psychological material that most people won't touch for another 2 decades. And that initiation, as violent as it feels, is forging integration capacity that will become your deepest strength. But shadow confrontation represents only one mechanism creating early struggle. There's a second dynamic equally powerful, your constitutional inability to merge with collective consciousness and the profound isolation that inability creates. Most people live in a state of unconscious merger Jung called participation mystique. The term comes from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who observed how consciousness can dissolve into group identity. where individual perspective vanishes and the boundary between self and collective becomes indistinguishable. You stop experiencing yourself as separate. You become the crowd, the ideology, the shared emotion. In modern life, this manifests everywhere. The office culture where everyone adopts the same opinions, the same communication style, the same ambitions without questioning why. The political movements where individual thought gets replaced by group certainty. The social media waves where everyone suddenly cares about the same thing with identical intensity, then moves on collectively when the algorithm shifts. The family systems where everyone agrees on the official narrative and any deviation feels like betrayal. Most people find this merger easy, natural even. It soothes the burden of individual consciousness. You don't have to carry the weight of independent judgment. You don't have to stand alone with your perceptions. The collective holds you, orients you, tells you what matters and what doesn't. You watch this happen and you cannot participate. Not because you're contrarian, not because you're trying to be different. You're constitutionally unable to merge. Your psyche refuses the dissolution. You stand at the edge of the collective wave, feeling it crash around you while your consciousness remains distinct, separate, observing. The physical sensation, watching everyone blend effortlessly while you remain outlined, visible, alone. Jung emphasized that only a highly developed consciousness of the power of the unconscious can enable an individual to withstand the power of the psychic flood sweeping everybody along. But you're not standing outside the flood because you've developed high consciousness. You're outside because your cognitive architecture won't let you merge unconsciously. Your knee dominance keeps pulling you toward pattern recognition, which means you see the collective dynamics rather than disappearing into them. This creates the most profound isolation of the rare type experience. Nothing isolates more completely than maintaining your individuality. When everyone else is merging, you're one person in 50, one in 70. Watching the other 49 or 69 dissolve into shared reality while you remain separate. You cannot distribute your psychological burden through collective participation. You carry it individually without the relief of shared carrying. The immediate consequences feel punishing. Early development marked by profound aloneness. Hypervigilance about relationships because you've learned that genuine understanding happens rarely. Major trust issues extending into adulthood because you've watched people merge with whatever collective wave arrived most recently, which means their individual judgment cannot be relied upon. But here's what you're accumulating that merged consciousness cannot access: clearer perception of collective dynamics, protection from regressive group states, independent thought capacity that remains functional when everyone around you is caught in mass psychology. You're developing discernment that participation mystique destroys. The majority experiences collective consciousness as comfort. You experience it as clarity that costs everything. You see the manipulation, the unconscious contagion, the way individual intelligence disappears into group emotion, and that seeing prevents you from accessing the soothing merger that makes early life socially survivable. This isn't superiority. This is the daily experience of psychic structure that cannot merge unconsciously with collective norms during precisely the decades when merger determines belonging. Your resistance isn't moral achievement, it's architectural necessity. But that resistance, as isolating as it is now, becomes profound resilience later, when the capacity for independent thought, maintained through decades of forced separation, finally reveals itself as the rarest and most needed capability in a world drowning in unconscious collective participation. Shadow confrontation and participation mystique resistance create two layers of early struggle. But there's a third mechanism operating beneath awareness: one involving the contrasexual archetype and why its integration delays so dramatically for rare types. Inside your unconscious lives a figure you've never met consciously but who shapes every intimate relationship you attempt. Jung called this the contrasexual archetype. For men, the anima, the feminine dimension within. For women, the animus, the masculine dimension within. Not gender roles, not stereotypes. Psychological structures representing the soul bridge to your own depths and to genuine relationship with others. Jung wrote, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definitive feminine image." The same applies inversely for women. This internal figure operates as mediator between ego and unconscious, shaping how you experience intimacy, creativity, emotional depth, and spiritual connection. Integration follows developmental stages. The anima in men moves from Eve, purely biological, indistinguishable from the personal mother, through Helen, the romantic femme fatale, through Mary, the spiritual and devoted, to Sophia, wisdom herself, where women can finally be experienced as individuals rather than containers for unconscious projection. The animus in women develops through parallel stages, from man of physical power through man of action and man of the word, to mediator of spiritual meaning. But integration requires something most people don't develop until midlife: completed shadow work. Jung called shadow integration the apprentice piece of individuation. Animus work is the masterpiece, possible only after shadow has been adequately confronted. This sequencing matters. You cannot integrate contrasexual material while still projecting massive shadow content. The work demands clean psychological ground. For rare types, this creates compounded delay. You're already confronting shadow prematurely in adolescence and 20s, which means you're doing apprentice-level work during the exact years when you should be building conventional relationship capacity, while your peers are dating, partnering, learning social romantic skills through trial and error. You're psychologically fragmenting through premature shadow encounter. By the time your shadow work reaches sufficient integration to begin anima-animus work, you're already in your 30s or 40s, and you're starting the relational development that others completed in their 20s. 4 dynamics compound the delay. First, strong identification with parental complexes blocks access to the archetypal layer. If you're still unconsciously merged with your actual mother or father, you cannot meet the archetypal mother or father within. Second, cultural repression of masculine traits in women or feminine traits in men creates additional barriers. For INTJ women, only 0.9% of the female population, expressing natural thinking dominant cognitive style often triggers social punishment that drives authentic qualities underground. Third, projection. You project the anima or animus onto romantic partners, which prevents internal recognition. You seek wholeness through finding the right person rather than through internal integration, and every relationship disappoints because no external person can carry your internal archetype sustainably. Fourth, insufficient ego strength. The emotional intensity of anima-animus confrontation demands robust ego structure. Without it, the encounter overwhelms rather than integrates. The relational consequences manifest with painful clarity. Relationships in your 20s feel confusing, unsatisfying, like you're speaking different languages. You attract partners who seem to carry something you need, then discover they're reflecting your own disowned material. Patterns repeat. You feel perpetually disappointed by intimacy that never reaches the depth you sense is possible. But Jung emphasized that anima and animus can never be fully integrated. They remain autonomous despite the integration of their contents. The work isn't conquest, it's relationship. Learning to dialogue with this internal figure rather than projecting it outward or being possessed by it. And that dialogue, as delayed as its arrival feels, produces something conventional. relationship development cannot match. Profound relational magnetism emerging from balanced inner opposites. Not needing another person to complete you, but meeting them as whole, encountering whole. Your relational delay isn't romantic failure. It's the time required for internal architecture that makes genuine meeting possible. These three mechanisms, premature shadow confrontation, participation mystique resistance, and anima-animus integration lag, operate simultaneously throughout your 20s and 30s. But there's a synthesis point where they converge, the transcendent function, and why its premature activation creates both profound crisis and eventual transformation. At the center of Jung's psychology lives a mechanism he called the transcendent function, and understanding it explains why your early suffering eventually transforms into late advantage. Jung clarified this is nothing mysterious or metaphysical, but rather a psychological function comparable to mathematical operations. It's the process by which conscious and unconscious unite through dialectical synthesis, pulling the psyche toward the wholeness it's meant to become. The mechanism operates through confrontation. Thesis, your conscious ego position. Antithesis, the unconscious shadow position. These opposites meet in sustained tension, and if you can hold that tension without collapsing into either side, a third position emerges, synthesized, more complete, transcending the original conflict. This is how the psyche heals its internal civil war. For most people, the transcendent function activates at midlife. The persona you've built begins cracking. The career that defined you feels hollow. The relationship that worked for years suddenly doesn't. Everything you've constructed to avoid confronting unconscious material stops functioning, and the opposites you've kept separated force their way into consciousness, demanding synthesis. Midlife crisis isn't a cliché. It's the transcendent function arriving on schedule, usually between 40 and 55, when you have enough ego development to survive the encounter. You experience this in your 20s, sometimes your teens. Your psyche doesn't wait for adequate ego strength. The opposites collide prematurely. The tension between who you're trying to be and what's operating unconsciously becomes unbearable. You cannot maintain the split. Your consciousness fragments under the pressure of holding contradictions you don't have the resources to synthesize. The physical sensation, your psyche tearing itself apart to rebuild from more authentic foundation. Jungian analyst Jeffrey Miller describes the transcendent function as drawing you forward toward the wholeness you are meant to be. But when it activates before you're developmentally ready, that forward pull feels like psychic disintegration. You experience years, Jung himself spent 3 to 7 years in this state, of profound instability. Nothing makes sense. Every identity you've tried collapses. You cannot find stable ground because your psyche is actively dissolving inadequate structures. The risk is real. Without sufficient ego strength, the transcendent function can trigger ego disintegration, psychosis, or extended crisis that destroys rather than transforms. This is why Jung emphasized the process typically requires midlife maturity. But if you survive premature activation, and survival requires every resource you can gather, the integration proves more thorough than delayed integration ever could. You're not relying on persona structures to hold opposites apart because you never built adequate persona. You're not defending against unconscious material through conventional achievement because conventional achievement failed you. You're forced into direct confrontation with the split in your psyche, and that confrontation, as violent as it is, accomplishes in your 20s and 30s what others won't face until their 50s. The internal civil war, conscious versus unconscious, ego versus shadow, persona versus authenticity, reaches synthesis point earlier. And when synthesis arrives, it releases what Jung called clean energy. Unified psychic drive. The fragmentation that defined your early experience transforms into coherent force. This is the emergence pattern. After years of internal warfare, sudden clarity. After decades of feeling fragmented, integrated purpose. The moment when all that accumulated psychological depth finally interfaces with external reality, and you discover that the struggle wasn't preventing your development, but was your development. Contemporary neuroscience validates what Jung observed clinically. MIT and Massachusetts General Hospital research analyzing nearly 50,000 participants found that overall mental functioning peaks between ages 55 and 60, not 25. The cultural emphasis on early achievement reflects collective preference, not developmental truth. Your premature transcendent function activation isn't psychological failure. It's accelerated synthesis. The crisis that arrives too early creates the wholeness that emerges right on time. Now we move from hidden mechanisms to empirical validation. What does contemporary research actually reveal about late bloomers? And why does the data confirm everything Jung observed about delayed development? Everything you've been told about cognitive decline after your 20s is wrong. Researchers at MIT and Massachusetts General Hospital analyzed data from nearly 50,000 participants and discovered something that demolishes the early peak narrative. Different cognitive abilities peak at dramatically different ages across the entire lifespan. Processing speed peaks at 18, short-term memory at 25, facial recognition at 32, the ability to read emotional states in others, 40s and 50s, vocabulary and crystallized intelligence, the capacity to synthesize accumulated knowledge into wisdom, late 60s to early 70s. A 2025 study published in Intelligence examined overall mental functioning and found the peak occurring between ages 55 and 60, not 25, not 30. The decade you were told represents decline actually marks cognitive culmination. This validates Jung's observation about individuation timelines. The psyche reaches its fullest expression in the second half of life, not the first. Late bloomer researcher Rich Karlgaard discovered that executive function, your brain's capacity for planning, impulse control, sustained attention, doesn't fully mature until age 25. For some individuals, even later. And UCLA research on brain myelination revealed that the myelin sheaths speeding neural transmission don't reach peak volume until your 50s, with ongoing repair continuing throughout life. You are literally still building the neurological infrastructure for peak performance throughout your entire middle age. But here's where it connects directly to rare types. Karlgaard identified what he calls the hidden strengths that late bloomers develop during their years of apparent struggle: curiosity, insight, compassion, resilience, wisdom. These aren't consolation prizes. These are the exact capacities that complex achievement requires, and that early bloomers, rushing through conventional timelines, often fail to develop. MBTI-specific data confirms the pattern with surgical precision. Research from Truity analyzing income trajectories found that INTJ and INTP types are late bloomers who tend to earn their highest incomes in their 50s. All four introverted intuitive types showed higher likelihood of pursuing extended education, which partially explains slow career starts, but the deeper explanation involves what we've been tracking: premature individuation work consuming the energy others direct toward conventional achievement. INFJ coach Lauren Sapala documents that most INFJ artists and writers don't pursue their true calling until later in life. Usually, it's after 40. Not because they lack capability earlier, because the depth required for their particular form of creative expression demands decades of internal architecture building that conventional timelines cannot accommodate. This is not delay. This is alignment. Your psyche reaching the developmental stage where accumulated depth can finally interface with external expression. The post-traumatic growth research adds another layer. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun discovered that 50 to 70% of trauma survivors experience genuine psychological growth from their struggle, not just resilience, but transformation. The 5 domains of growth they identified: stronger relationships, new possibilities, personal strength, spiritual change, greater life appreciation, map directly onto successful individuation outcomes. Historian J. Marvin Eisenstadt examined 699 eminent Americans and found that 45% had lost a parent before age 21. The same adversity that destroys some becomes the catalyst for extraordinary achievement in others. And the determining factor is what psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman identifies as cognitive exploration, curiosity combined with processing flexibility. Early struggle plus cognitive openness equals accelerated development. You spent your 20s and 30s in what felt like failure, underemployed, relationally confused, socially isolated, watching peers achieve milestones you couldn't reach. But you were accumulating something they weren't. Depth forged through premature psychological work, resilience built through sustained isolation, discernment developed through constitutional inability to merge with collective norms. And now, approaching or passing 40, you're discovering that the timeline you thought was broken was actually precise. Your late blooming isn't compensation for early failure. It's the fruition of internal work that required exactly as long as it took. Understanding the pattern intellectually changes nothing by itself. Integration requires specific practices, boundary development, and navigation of real dangers that advanced individuation creates. This is where theory becomes lived wisdom. Recognizing the pattern changes nothing. Integration requires practice. First, learn to distinguish soul time from ego timeline. Your psyche operates according to internal developmental necessity, not cultural milestones. When you're 35 and peers are established in careers, relationships, identities, and you're still feeling incomplete, you're not behind. You're gestating deeper structures that cannot be rushed. The physical markers of active individuation, dreams intensifying in frequency and symbolic density, recurring themes appearing across different life domains, the sensation of being worked on by something larger than your conscious will, exhaustion that comes not from external demands, but from psychic reorganization happening beneath awareness. Stop comparing your 30s to others' 30s. You're not on their timeline, you're on yours. Second, develop dynamic boundary maintenance, especially if you're INFJ with porous energetic structure. Your extroverted feeling auxiliary function makes you incredibly attuned to the emotions of others. But without boundaries, that attunement becomes absorption. You feel others' anger in your chest, their anxiety in your stomach, their depression as your own weight. The practice, regular self-inquiry. Is this emotion mine? Not once, continuously. When intensity arrives, pause before assuming ownership. Track where it started. Notice if it intensified after encountering a specific person or entering a specific environment. Learn to distinguish between empathy, feeling with someone while maintaining your center, and enmeshment, losing your center entirely in their emotional field. Visualization works. Imagine a permeable membrane around your psychic space, flexible enough to allow genuine connection, firm enough to prevent invasion. Practice saying no in small moments before you're forced to say it in large ones. The infamous INFJ door slam, complete relational severing, happens when you've failed to maintain moderate boundaries for so long that complete closure becomes your only protection. The goal isn't imperviousness, it's conscious permeability, choosing what you allow in rather than absorbing everything indiscriminately. Third, integrate your inferior function without forcing mastery. After 40, your inferior extroverted sensing begins naturally awakening. This doesn't mean suddenly becoming a sensor. It means developing practical awareness that grounds your intuitive depth in present reality. Mature. See, integration looks like this. You still process through knee-dominant pattern recognition, but you notice when you need to eat, when your body requires rest, when the physical environment demands attention. You begin thinking with your body rather than despite it. The future focus that defined your 20s gains present moment anchoring. You stop missing flights because you're finally tracking concrete details alongside abstract patterns. Don't pursue C proficiency, pursue C relationship. Let your inferior function contribute its perspective without demanding it perform beyond its capacity. Fourth, recognize the inflation danger that advanced individuation creates. Your psychological depth is real. Your capacity for pattern recognition exceeds the majority. Your resistance to collective norms protected you from regressive group states. All of this is true, and all of it can fuel what Jung called ego inflation, identifying your ego with archetypal power. When you begin experiencing real integration, the transcendent function producing synthesis, shadow material becoming conscious, anima or animus entering dialogue, there's a temptation to believe you've achieved special status. The messianic trap. You're not experiencing wisdom, you are wise. You're not encountering archetypal truth, you embody it. Jungian followers observe that one of the most dangerous people you could meet is a therapist or guru in an inflation. Someone who's done genuine depth work but claimed ownership of insights that belong to the self, not the ego. Safeguards, ongoing shadow work, even after initial integration. Reality testing with trusted others, humility practices, recognition that every insight, every breakthrough, every moment of clarity comes through you but doesn't belong to you. Jung emphasized that the individuated person carries both light and shadow consciously, neither inflated by achievement nor deflated by failure. Integration means holding your genuine psychological advancement without letting it collapse into superiority. You're further along the individuation path than most people your age. That's structural fact, not moral achievement. And that advancement carries responsibility to model wholeness without claiming transcendence. The psyche demands you stay human while becoming whole. There's one final image that captures what wholeness actually looks like for rare types who've survived this demanding path. An image that appears spontaneously at exactly the moment when fragmentation transforms into integration. Jung created his first mandala in 1916, long before learning that Eastern traditions had been using this symbol for millennia. He was emerging from years of psychological crisis, his own confrontation with the unconscious, and found himself spontaneously drawing circular images. Over time, he realized what they represented: the self, the wholeness of the personality, which, if all goes well, is harmonious. The Sanskrit word means magic circle, but there's nothing mystical about its psychological function. Mandalas appear spontaneously at what Jung called nodal crises, moments of psychic fragmentation when the personality threatens to dissolve, the onset of psychotic or neurotic episodes. Divorce, wartime trauma, major life transitions. Any experience where your sense of self shatters and the pieces scatter. At exactly these moments, the psyche produces circular imagery, not consciously, not through effort. The mandala emerges from the unconscious as spontaneous compensation, imposing order on chaos, creating a center around which everything else can reorganize. The structure contains specific elements: circularity, representing wholeness and containment; quaternity, 4 gates, 4 directions, 4 elements, symbolizing the tension of opposites held in balance; and the center, representing the self as organizing principle, the still point around which personality revolves. Jung emphasized that the fourfold structure restrains inflation by distributing value equally among all four elements. When you're tempted to identify entirely with one aspect, pure intuition, pure thinking, pure feeling, the mandala reminds you that wholeness requires all functions integrated, not one function dominant at the expense of others. For dominant types, mandala formation marks the moment when inferior C and other underdeveloped functions finally find their place in your psychic architecture. You spent decades with dominant Ni overwhelming everything else, living almost entirely in future patterns, abstract meanings, symbolic synthesis. Integration doesn't diminish that dominance. It creates space for the other functions to contribute without threatening your primary mode. The mandala doesn't represent arrival. It represents ongoing process. Jung called individuation a lifelong journey, not a destination reached and completed, but the mandala marks the shift from fragmentation to organization, from psychic civil war to psychic coherence. And this coherence, built through decades of premature shadow confrontation, participation mystique resistance, delayed anima-animus integration, and transcendent function synthesis, produces something that conventional development cannot match: the authority of authentic development. Not the authority of credentials, achievement, or social validation. The authority that comes from having survived the dissolution of false structures and rebuilt from genuine foundation. The authority of someone who knows their shadow, maintains boundaries consciously, and relates to unconscious material without being possessed by it. Your late blooming carries this authority. When you finally emerge, 40, 45, 50, you're not performing success. You're expressing depth that required exactly this long to integrate, and in a world increasingly fragmented, increasingly caught in collective unconsciousness, increasingly desperate for models of genuine wholeness, your emergence matters. Not because you're special, because you're whole, or at least because you're committed to the lifelong work of becoming whole. This path demanded everything: early isolation, premature crisis, years of appearing behind while doing work others won't face for decades. But it offers something conventional development cannot provide: genuine integration in a world of performed identity, real depth in a culture of shallow achievement, conscious wholeness modeling what's possible when you refuse to shortcut the process. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, know your struggle wasn't failure. It was preparation. Your delay wasn't deficit. It was design. And your late blooming may be arriving at exactly the moment the world needs what only this path produces: people who've survived individuation and can show others what wholeness actually requires. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment with your reflections. What does your path of delayed development look like? Are you in the struggle phase or the emergence phase? Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.